The sky above the Arizona Territory didn't just rain that afternoon. It seemed to be trying to wash the world clean of its sins. Cassidy Flynn, a man whose life was etched into the deep lines of his weathered face, was miles from the comfort of his hearth, wrestling with a section of cattle fence that the wind was determined to flatten. The thunder rolled like artillery fire across the canyons, shaking the ground beneath his boots. But it was a different sound that made him freeze, a sound that cut through the cacophony of the storm like a serrated blade. A scream. It wasn't the cry of a mountain lion or the shriek of a hawk. It was human, and it was desperate. Dropping his hammer, Cassidy pushed through the blinding sheets of rain, following the sound toward Devil's Canyon. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to drag him down with every step. But he pressed on, driven by an instinct that was older than his ranching days. When he reached the rocky outcrop, the lightning illuminated a scene that made his breath catch in his throat. A massive section of the cliff face had sheared off, creating a landslide of jagged boulders. Trapped beneath the debris were two figures. He scrambled down the slope, sliding uncontrollably in the slurry of mud and shale. Up close, the situation was dire. Two women lay pinned, their legs crushed under rocks that would have taken two men to lift on a dry day. But these weren't ordinary women. Even covered in mud and blood, their stature was imposing, nearly 6 feet tall, with the lean, corded muscle of predators. They were Apache. In this part of the territory, finding an Apache usually meant death was close behind, but Cassidy didn't see enemies. He saw pain. The first woman, conscious but grimacing, locked eyes with him. Her gaze wasn't fearful. It was calculating, assessing him as a threat even as she lay helpless. "I'm going to get you out," Cassidy shouted over the roar of the wind, his voice raw. He didn't wait for permission. He jammed a thick pine branch under the main boulder, using it as a fulcrum. His muscles screamed in protest, tendons straining to the snapping point as he heaved. The rock groaned, shifting just enough. The woman dragged herself free, not with a cry of relief, but with a sharp intake of breath. She immediately turned to the second figure, her sister, identical in features, but currently unconscious. A nasty gash bleeding freely across her forehead. Die. "If you leave," the conscious one managed in broken English, her dark eyes flashing. "I'm not leaving anyone," Cassidy grunted. He abandoned the leva and grabbed the second rock with his bare hands. Adrenaline flooding his system, he lifted until black spots danced in his vision, holding the weight just long enough for the first sister to pull the unconscious one free. The journey back to his cabin was a blur of agony and endurance, and Cassidy carried the unconscious sister, whose dead weight nearly drove him into the mud a dozen times. The other sister, Nia, limped beside him, refusing his arm, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, despite the blinding rain. She moved like a wounded wolf, dangerous, proud, and unwilling to show weakness. By the time Cassidy kicked open the door of his humble cabin, his lungs were burning, and his legs felt like lead. He laid the unconscious woman, Kira, on his only bed. The cabin was small, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the violence outside. Cassidy moved quickly, tearing strips from his spare cotton shirt. "I need to clean that wound," he said, gesturing to Kira's head. Nia stood by the fireplace, shivering slightly but watching his every move with the intensity of a hawk. She nodded, once a silent permission, as Cassidy worked, cleaning the blood and binding the wound with gentle, practiced hands. The atmosphere in the room shifted. He wasn't just a white rancher anymore, and they weren't just savages as the townspeople would say. In the quiet warmth of the cabin, the barriers of war and hatred seemed too thin. Nia watched his hands, rough, calloused hands that could have easily hurt them but instead offered tenderness. When he finished with Kira, he turned to Nia. "Your leg?" he said softly. She hesitated, then sat on the sturdy wooden chair. As he peeled back the ruined fabric of her moccasin to reveal the bruising and cuts, the air between them grew thick, charged with something Cassidy couldn't name. It was electricity, distinct from the storm outside. "Oh," Nia asked, her voice clearer now, the English accented but strong. "White men ... they kill us. Or worse." Cassidy looked up, meeting her gaze. "I don't leave people to die. Doesn't matter who they are." The answer seemed to puzzle her. She studied his face, looking for the lie, but found only exhaustion and honesty. "You're different," she murmured. Night fell, wrapping the cabin in a heavy darkness, broken only by the flickering light of the hearth. Kira had regained consciousness, her eyes snapping open with a warrior's alertness. She and Nia spoke in rapid, hushed Apache, their voices rising and falling like a strange melody. Cassidy busied himself with making a stew, trying to give them privacy, but he could feel their eyes on him. They were discussing him, he knew it in his bones, but when they ate, they did so with a grace that surprised him, their movements synchronized, as if they shared a single mind. The heat in the small room rose, not just from the fire. Every time Cassidy looked up, he found one of them watching him, not with gratitude, but with a hunger that unnerved him. It wasn't just hunger for food. It was a curiosity that bordered on possessiveness. "We cannot go," Kira announced suddenly, her voice deeper than her sister's. "The storm hides our tracks, but my head spins like a top. You take the bed." Cassidy, off it, grabbing a blanket. "I'll sleep by the fire," Nania interjected, standing up. Her injured leg didn't seem to bother her as much now. She moved closer to him, her height nearly matching his. "We do not take a man's bed in his own house while he sleeps on the floor. That is not ... honorable." "We will sleep by the fire," Kira added, joining her sister. "Together?" The word hung in the air. "Together?" Cassidy swallowed hard, nodding. He retreated to his small bedroom, but sleep was a distant hope. Through the thin walls, he heard the rustle of their movements, the soft whispers that seemed to drift through the cracks in the wood. He lay in the dark, his mind racing. He knew who they were now, their bearing, their jewelry, the quality of their buckskins. They were highborn, likely the daughters of a chief. Helping them was dangerous. Hiding them was treason. But turning them away was impossible. He woke to a silence so profound it felt heavy. The storm had broken. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window pane, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Cassidy sat up, rubbing his face, and walked into the main room. They were already awake, standing near the door, staring at him. They had cleaned themselves up as best they could. Their hair was braided intricately, and they stood with shoulders squared, looking less like refugees and more like queens holding court in a peasant's shack. "The storm is over," Cassidy said, his voice gravelly with sleep. "I can saddle the horse? Get you close to the canyon pass?" Nia shook her head slowly. She took a step toward him, closing the distance until he could smell the rain and sage on her skin. "We have discussed this," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sent a shiver down Cassidy's spine. "Discussed?" "What?" Cassidy asked, backing up until he hit the edge of his table. Kira moved to his other side, flanking him. The movement was predatory, yet entirely alluring. "We have discussed you, Cassidy Flynn," she said, using his name for the first time. It sounded foreign and beautiful on her tongue. "You saved us. You touched us with gentle hands. You asked for nothing." "I did what anyone would do," Cassidy stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "No," Nia corrected, placing a hand on his chest. Her palm was warm, searing through his shirt. "A weak man would have run. A cruel man would have taken. You are neither? You are ... worthy." "Worthy of what?" The question barely left his lips before the air outside shattered. The sound of hoofbeats thundered against the earth, rhythmic and fast. A lot of them. Cassidy froze, his eyes darting to the window. "Riders?" he hissed. 4, maybe 5. Nia and Kira exchanged a look not of fear, but of grim determination. "Search party," Kira said, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. "If they find us here, they'll kill me." Cassidy finished the thought. "No," Nia said, fiercely, her grip on his shirt tightening. "They will have to go through us." "It won't matter if they think I kidnapped you," Cassidy argued, panic rising. "Hide. The root cellar, out back." "We do not hide," Kira stated, her chin lifting. "We are the daughters of War Chief Ayana. We do not cower in holes." The hoofbeats stopped abruptly in the yard. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder had been. Then, a heavy fist pounded on the door, shaking the hinges. "Open up," a voice bellowed. Not in English, but in the guttural tones of the Apache tongue, followed by broken, angry English. "White man, we know you are in there." Cassidy looked at the two women. In a span of 24 hours, his quiet, lonely life had been obliterated. He was trapped in his own cabin with 2 warrior princesses, an angry war party outside, and a terrifying realization dawning in his chest. He didn't want them to leave. He grabbed his rifle from the rack, not to threaten them, but to stand with them. "Stay behind me," Cassidy ordered, though he knew they wouldn't listen. Nia leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, a contrast to the deadly situation. "Do not die today, Cassidy Flynn. We have plans for you." Before he could process the promise in her voice, the door exploded inward, splintering under the force of a kick. Dust and light flooded the room, outlining the hulking silhouettes of 4 Apache warriors. Weapons drawn, eyes scanning the room for blood, they found instead their chief's daughters, alive, unharmed, and flanking a white rancher who looked ready to fight the devil himself for them. Asterisk. The dust from the kicked-in door swirled in the shafts of sunlight, creating a haze between the barrel of the Winchester rifle and Cassidy Flynn's chest. The lead warrior, Takakota, held the weapon with the steady hands of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. His dark eyes flicked from the shattered wood to Cassidy, and then to the women standing on either side of him like shielding wings. "Lower the weapon," Takakota Nia's voice rang out, authoritative and cold. It wasn't a request. It was a command from the blood of the chief. The warrior hesitated. He saw the bandages on Kira's head, the splint on Nia's leg, and the defiant set of the white rancher's jaw. Slowly, the tension in the room shifted. Takakota didn't lower the rifle completely, but he eased his finger off the trigger. "The chief believes you dead," he growled in Apache, his gaze narrowing at Cassidy. "He will want to know why a white man stands between his daughters and his warriors." "Then he shall know," Kira said, stepping forward, her hand still resting possessively near Cassidy's arm. "We ride now." The journey to the Apache stronghold was a surreal blur for Cassidy. They didn't tie his hands, a small mercy granted, only because Nia had insisted, but he was surrounded. He rode his own mare but flanked so closely by warriors that their stirrups often brushed as Nia and Kira rode at the front, their posture upright despite their injuries. Leading the procession like returning conquerors, Cassidy caught glimpses of them looking back at him, their expressions unreadable to the others, but carrying a secret weight for him. "Do not fear," their eyes seemed to say. "Trust us." 2 hours later, the canyon walls narrowed, opening up into a hidden valley that Cassidy had only heard of in terrified whispers at the saloon. The settlement was vast, a sprawl of teepees and wickiups, smoke curling lazily into the azure sky. As the party approached, the daily rhythm of the camp ground to a halt. Silence rippled outward like a wave. All eyes, hundreds of them, on the white man riding in their midst. Chief Ayana emerged from the largest structure. He was a mountain of a man, his hair streaked with iron gray, wearing the weight of leadership like a physical mantle. He did not run to his daughters. He stood like a stone pillar, waiting. When Nia and Kira dismounted, limping slightly, a flicker of momentary relief perhaps crossed his stoic face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the hard mask of the war chief. "Father," Nia said, bowing her head slightly, "we have returned." Ayana's gaze bypassed them completely, locking onto Cassidy. The intensity of the stare felt like a physical blow. "And you have brought a guest. A white guest." "He is not a guest," Kira corrected, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. "He is our savior. The rocks took us, Father. The storm tried to bury us. This man, he dug us out with his bare hands. When our own strength failed," Ayana slowly walked toward Cassidy. The rancher dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with a thud. He forced himself to stand tall, remembering Nia's advice. "Show no fear." "Is this true, Rancha?" Ayana asked, his English surprisingly refined. "You saved the daughters of your enemy?" "I don't see enemies when people are hurting, Chief," Cassidy replied, his voice steady though, his heart hammered against his ribs. "I just saw 2 women who needed help." Ayana studied him for a long, agonizing moment. Then he nodded once. "Then you have my gratitude. You will be given supplies and safe passage to the edge of our lands." It was a dismissal, a pardon. Cassidy should have taken it. He should have mounted his horse and ridden back to his lonely cabin and his broken fence. But before he could move, Nia and Kira stepped between him and their father. "He does not go," Nia stated. DeCamp gasped. To defy the chief was rare. To do so in front of a stranger was unheard of. Ayana's brow furrowed. "Exclaim. We had a vision, Father," Kira said, her voice taking on a rhythmic, chanting quality. "In the cave, under the weight of the stone, before he came for us. We saw our path. We saw the man who would walk it with us." She turned and placed a hand flat on Cassidy's chest. "It is him." Ayana looked from his daughters to the rancher, his face darkening. "He is white. He is not of the people. And yet you speak as if you both choose him." "We do," Nia said, lifting her chin. "As our great-grandmother did, in the times before the long wars. When 2 sisters found a soul worthy of both, they did not divide him. They shared him." The silence in the camp was absolute. Cassidy felt the blood rush to his face. The 2 sisters' tradition was a myth, a story told to shock settlers, but here they were, invoking it as law. "You asked for the old way," Ayana said, softly, his voice dangerous. "For a white man." "We ask for this man," Nia countered. "He risked his life for us without knowing who we were. He protected our honor when we were vulnerable in his home. He has the heart of an Apache, even if his skin is pale." Ayana turned his back on them, pacing the small circle of cleared earth. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Finally he turned back, his eyes blazing. "You ask much," the chief growled. "You ask me to welcome a stranger into the heart of my bloodline. Words are wind, deeds are stone." He pointed a calloused finger at Cassidy. "If you want the old way, White Rancher, you must prove you can survive it. You must prove you are not just a kind man, but a strong one, worthy of a chief's daughters." Cassidy looked at the sisters. They were watching him with that same intense, hungry look they had in the cabin. He realized. It was all about choice. He stepped forward, leaving the safety of the sisters' shadows. "What do I have to do?" Cassidy asked. Ayana smiled, and it was not a kind smile. 3 trials, by sunset tomorrow. First you must provide. You will hunt the shadow buck that stalks the high ridges alone with only a knife and bow. Second, you must show wisdom. You will sit in the council circle and resolve a dispute of blood that has plagued our families for a moon. And third, Ayana paused, his eyes gleaming. You must show courage. You will retrieve the eagle's feather from the spire of a climb that breaks even our strongest young men. And if I fail? Cassidy asked. Then you die, Ayanna said simply. Or you leave in shame, never to see my daughters again. I accept, Cassidy said, the words leaving his mouth before his brain could catch up. The camp erupted into low murmurs. Ayanna nodded, gesturing to Takakota. Take his rifle. Give him a bow. The trials begin at dawn. Night fell over the canyon, but this time, Cassidy was not alone in the dark. Nia and Kira led him to a secluded wiki up at the edge of the camp, away from the prying eyes of the warriors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of sweet grass. You are a fool, Nia whispered, though Cheval smiling as she unlaced his boots. The shadow buck has not been caught in years. The spire is vertical glass. I didn't have much of a choice, Cassidy replied, wincing as he sat down. I couldn't just walk away. Not after ... not after seeing you. Kira knelt before him, taking his weathered hands in hers. The firelight danced in her dark eyes. You accepted the trials? That means you accepted us. Both of us. I don't know anything about being an Apache, Cassidy admitted, his voice rough. I don't know if I can be what you need. You already are, Nia said, moving to sit beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. Strength is not just about muscles, or arrows, Cassidy. It is about the heart. And tonight, ... She leaned in, her lips grazing his jawline. Tonight, before you face death for us, we want to show you exactly what life will look like if you succeed. Kira moved closer on his other side, and for the second time, Cassidy found himself trapped between them. But this was not a trap of rocks or danger. It was a circle of warmth, of soft skin, and fierce affection. We do not sleep apart tonight, Kira whispered against his neck. Tonight, we bind our spires so that when you climb the spire, you will not be climbing alone. You will carry us with you. As the fire died down to embers, Cassidy Flynn, the poor rancher from nowhere, realized he was the richest man in the territory. And as the sisters pulled him down into the firs, he knew he would climb that mountain. He would hunt that buck. He would do whatever it took. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth dying for and 2 reasons to live. But outside, the wind began to howl through the canyon, carrying the scent of a storm. And deep in the darkness, Takakato sharpened his knife, watching the wiki up with eyes that held no promise of a fair fight. The trials would be hard, but the treachery of men might be harder. The sun had barely crested the canyon walls when Cassidy stood at the edge of the camp, the borrowed bow heavy in his grip. The air was crisp, biting at his exposed skin, but the memory of the sisters' warmth from the night before acted like a shield against the cold. He looked toward the wiki up where Nia and Kira remained. They were forbidden to watch the hunt, a test that demanded solitude. The shadow buck runs the ridgeline, Takakota sneered, shoving a quiver of arrows into Cassidy's chest. It sees the wind. It hears the grass grow. A white man with a toy bow will starve. Cassidy ignored the taunt, slinging the quiver over his shoulder. Keep the fire hot, Takakota. I'll be back with the meat. The first trial. The hunt tracking the buck was a lesson in humility. The terrain was unforgiving loose shale that clattered with every misstep and dry brush that snapped like gunshots. Cassidy fell back on his rancher instincts, moving slow, breathing shallow. He found the tracks near a dried creek bed, but he also found something else. A fresh moccasin print over the hoofmark. Takota. The warrior wasn't just doubting him. He was hunting the hunter. Cassidy stopped, closing his eyes. He couldn't outsneak an Apache warrior in his own backyard, but he could outwait him. He climbed a twisted mesquite tree, wedging himself high in the branches, and froze. He became part of the wood. An hour passed, then his legs cramped, screaming in protest, but he didn't move. Finally, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. Takakota, looking impatient, scanning the ground for the white man he'd lost. The warrior moved on, assuming Cassidy had gone higher up the ridge. 10 minutes later, the shadow buck appeared. It was massive, its antlers like a crown of driftwood. Stepping cautiously into the clearing Takakota had just vacated, Cassidy drew the string to his cheek, exhaled, and loosed the arrow. It flew true, striking the beast behind the shoulder. The buck ran 10 yards and collapsed when Cassidy dragged the carcass into camp. Sweat-drenched and bloody, the silence was deafening. He dropped the beast at Ayanna's feet. Takakota stood in the background, his face a mask of shock and fury. The white man has luck, Takakota spat. Luck doesn't aim an arrow, Ayanna said, his eyes measuring Cassidy with new respect. The first trial is past. The second trial, the wisdom midday, brought the heat and the council. The elders sat in a circle, their faces like carved leather. In the center stood 2 angry men from rival families, arguing over the rights to a spring that had dwindled to a trickle in the drought. He dams the flow, one shouted. He takes more than his share for his horses, the other countered. Solve this, Rancha, Ayanna commanded, sitting on his buffalo hide. If you are to be of the people, you must keep the peace among the people. Cassidy stepped into the circle. He knew water rights. In the west, men killed for less. He looked at the trickle of water on the map drawn in the dirt. He didn't look at the men. He looked at the problem. The water does not belong to the horse, and it does not belong to the dam, Cassidy said, his voice carrying the rough cadence of the frontier. It belongs to the land. You fight because you fear the dry days. If you divide the water, the stream dies, and both herds die. He took a stick and drew a line through the center of the dispute. Tear down the dam. Combine the herds at the drinking hour. You monitor his horses, he monitors yours. If the stream runs dry, you dig a new well together. A burden shared is half the weight. A water source fought over is dust. The elders murmured. It was a practical solution, devoid of ego. It forced cooperation over dominance. Ayana nodded slowly. He speaks not with the tongue of a conqueror, but with the mind of a caretaker. The second trial is past. The third trial. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. The final test remained. The spire of spirits was a needle of granite rising 300 feet from the canyon floor. At its peak, in a small crevice, rested the eagle's feather placed there by the medicine man. Many have fallen, Nia whispered, having rushed to him before the climb. She pressed a small stone talisman into his hand. Do not look down. Look only to where you are going. I'm going to you, Cassidy said, gripping her hand. Both of you. The climb was a nightmare. The rock was hot, burning his fingertips, and the wind whipped around the spire, threatening to peel him off the face of the cliff. Halfway up, his boots slipped on crumbling shale. He dangled by 3 fingers, his breath hitching as rocks tumbled hundreds of feet into the void below. The entire camp watched in silence. Kira buried her face in Naya's shoulder, unable to watch. Cassidy pulled himself up, muscles trembling, his chest heaved. Why am I doing this? The thought shouted in his mind. I could be on a horse, halfway to Mexico. But then he remembered the night in the wiki up the feeling of being completely seen, completely wanted. He wasn't climbing for a feather, he was climbing for a life. He reached the top as the last sliver of sun vanished. His hand found the crevice. Fingers brushing the soft quill of the eagle feather, he snatched it, raising it high. A roar erupted from the canyon floor, echoing off the walls like thunder. The resolution the descent was easier, adrenaline fueling his movements. When his boots hit the earth, he was immediately flanked by Nia and Kira, who disregarded all protocol to embrace him, their tears mixing with the dust on his face. Cassidy walked to Chief Ayana, the feather in his hand. But before he could offer it, Takakota stepped forward, his knife drawn. He mocks us, Takakota shouted, his pride shattered. No white man has the spirit for this. He used magic. He used trickery. Cassidy didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his hands. He just looked at the warrior with pity. I used what I had, Takakota, my hands, my heart, and the love of these women. Ayana stood, his shadow long in the firelight. Put away the knife, Takakota. The rancher climbed the rock. I watched him. The spirits did not cast him down. Who are you to question what the spirits accept? It's she. Turned to Cassidy, taking the feather. He placed a hand on Cassidy's shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. You came here a stranger? You hunted our game? You solved our quarrels? You climbed our sacred stone? You are Cassidy Flynn no more? Ayana raised his voice to the camp. Tonight, the drums beat for a new sun. Tonight, the bloodlines merge. And in the ceremony was unlike anything Cassidy had ever known. The rhythmic pounding of the drums seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He stood before the great fire. Nia on his left, Kira on his right, their hands were bound together with strips of leather, symbolizing a knot that could not be untied. They didn't just marry him, they claimed him, and he claimed them. As the shaman spoke the ancient words, Cassidy looked at the 2 women who had appended his world. He saw the firelight reflected in their dark eyes that promised a future of wildness, of loyalty, and of a love that defied every rule he had been raised to obey. Later, as the celebration roared into the night, Cassidy sat by the fire, exhausted but alive in a way he had never been on his silent, lonely ranch. Nia rested her head on his shoulder, while Kira traced the lines of his palm. You gave up everything, Kira said softly, looking out at the stars. Your land, your people, your name. Cassidy smiled, pulling them both closer as the sparks drifted up toward the Milky Way. I didn't give up anything, Kira. I traded a life of surviving for a life of living. And so, the legend grew. In the saloons and trading posts, men whispered of the rancher who vanished into the canyons. Some said he died. Some said he went mad. But the Apache knew the truth. They told the story of the white wolf, the man with 2 hearts who loved the twin daughters of the storm. They told of a love that was strong enough to break the stone, wise enough to share the water, and brave enough to touch the sky. And high in the canyon, in a home filled with laughter and the strength of 3, Cassidy Flynn never once looked back.